Professor Rob Walker, thank you so much for joining me in the interview series on the 25th anniversary of CSPT Program Foundation. And you have been a founder of CSPT Program. So I would like to ask the first question by actually asking you to describe to me the Rob Walker who came to UVic before the CSPT program was founded. Where did you come from? Why did you come here? And so on.
I came from Queens, where I taught. I did a PhD at Queens. I taught in political studies, sociology, geography, a lot of different things. And I wrote a PhD on the topic of epistemological dualism and concepts of space as it applied to political thought in the modern period. So not exactly a saleable topic. I had a postdoc at Princeton. I had a postdoc at Australian National. I came back to Canada and there was not a single job. So I took some part-time things in Ottawa, working on Parliament Hill, and I then got a job in cultural studies, sociology at Trent. And I had faced an option: do I stay somewhere in Ontario, converting myself to a cultural studies, sociology person, or do I apply for the part-time jobs available out west? So I put my family and my plants and my cats into a truck and drove to Victoria, and eventually ended up in the political theory slot here. There weren't many jobs, fewer than there are now, but I felt myself very lucky to have arrived here. I was working in a whole range of areas, basically centered on philosophies of science, histories of space, histories of time, all very esoteric stuff. And finally slotted into the position here, political theory, along with Moran Magnuson. We had a kind of Tweedledum, Tweedledee relationship, more or less reinventing the undergraduate program in political theory. He had been working on the urban politics front. I'd been working increasingly interestedly in the international relations, global politics front. So we converged as a kind of global-local duo, confronting the more or less statist traditions of political analysis, and invented a curriculum which has worked fairly well down to this very day. But, that's the kind of thing.
How did the political science department look like when you came here?
It was basically organized on the one hand by more or less American-trained comparativists and more or less BC studies Canadian politics. So I guess the political theory kind of developed as a third part of the tripod, which organized the department for at least a decade, until the numbers increased and we had a much more pluralistic department. But the political theory stayed more or less as it was constructed in the early 1980s, with more people as it developed.
You didn't say what year you came here. What year?
Why do I came here?
Yeah. What year?
What year? I came here in 1980.
1980. Okay.
Yeah.
So how did the idea of a CSPT program came to your mind? How was it affected by your life here at UVic and in BC?
Well, I just mentioned the crucial thing, which is the convergence of Warren and myself and the attempt to develop something innovative in the political theory area. It worked very well, initially at the undergraduate level, then at the MA level. But you know, the 1980s were a time of some trauma for intellectuals of all kinds, as you may recall. And the kinds of intellectual worlds in which I'd grown up were being challenged quite radically around the world by what's now called neoliberalism or market things. And there was a local version in BC, which was a relatively wealthy place, but nevertheless was witnessing one of the more dramatic attempts to do the cutback, the economic cutback. And so a lot of us started thinking this is something to protest. And indeed, there were protests around the province. In the course of that protest, we discovered a fairly small number of like-minded people in the universities, and an even smaller number who had interest in theory. And basically out of that dynamic of more, how should we say, seeing a need for solidarity amongst our relatively minority feelings, and the opportunity to develop something interesting across the departments, led to us thinking about a program which involved philosophy, sociology, and political science. And it was then more or less a matter of trying to invent something that worked intellectually and even more worked institutionally.
Can you describe the way this sort of coming together of certain like-minded people at UVic was actually affected by the what you described as kind of 1980s version of neoliberalism in BC?
Well, it's at the time it all seemed fairly complex and traumatic, I guess. In retrospect, it was a fairly obvious set of dynamics generated by the changes around the late 70s, early 80s. I would say the amount of intellectual space in the disciplines I knew narrowed considerably. It was a revival of what used to be called positivism or empirical theory, but in a fairly narrow way, certainly in the literatures that I was familiar with. And theorists of all kinds felt themselves to be a bit lonely, whereas I'd grown up even in a fairly conservative university system with a very pluralistic understanding of the academy, multidisciplinary, theoretically oriented, and so on. And the thing just narrowed, so one tried to create some space. And well, in retrospect, it was all more or less, how should we say, determined by external events. At the time, it seemed to be determined by local events, the specificities of this university, which was a university full of always had very competent people, but it's never been a particularly theoretically inviting university. It's never been an interdisciplinary university. On the contrary, it's been rigidly disciplinary in my experience, despite much of the rhetoric. And so CSPT was just, how do we actually do serious work, scholarly work in the areas in which we're interested in? Because you cannot do it as a sociologist, you cannot do it as a political scientist, you cannot do it as a philosopher, you can't do it as an anthropologist, a geographer. You have to understand that you're dealing with intellectual currents which are cutting across not only the social sciences, but social sciences and humanities, and fairly obviously both of those and the sciences. So you really can't do any serious work within the disciplinary frame. So it was a matter of you had to do it, and you had to find people on campus you can talk to. And certainly from the point of view of teaching, one did not. One had to encourage students to take a wide range of courses in order to understand the background, at least, for whatever it was that was going to be taught, certainly at the upper undergraduate level and at the MA level. So I think it's just a matter of necessity, and reading the necessities of the time and making the most of it.
Can you elaborate on the intellectual ambience of your departments in which you guys felt lonely, basically, in terms of what you did?
Well, I wouldn't actually say, the relations on a personal level were always more or less amicable. You had, as in most departments in these areas at the time and probably forever, you had fairly important differences of methodological style, which meant political style, which meant philosophical style. And these differences are already built into the discipline, so we were filling already available slots. And theory has always had a peculiar place in political science, both for and against. It's always had a kind of privileged role because it has access to the history of a discipline, history of thinking, and no one in their right mind is going to say that Plato has got nothing to do with political science. So you have a certain leverage. But as you know, the term theory means many different things to many different people, and the attempt to define what theory is becomes a ground for working out all kinds of intellectual, scholarly differences and indeed political differences. So in this department, there had already been a fairly clear distinction between American trained and Canadian trained, and here come two Canadian trained but also European trained theorists with a very different understanding of what theory means, and with an ability to make that stuff actually exciting for undergraduates and graduates. So a certain level of intellectual discussion and some controversies. I mean, we had to go through the tenure process, of course, and that wasn't an easy thing given the external political struggles that were going on. And the university was growing, and the social sciences were becoming quite large as a teaching entity, and on the whole were not attracting theoretically oriented faculty. So both in terms of the internalities of a particular department and in terms of the availability of people to talk to outside, it was a fairly obvious progression.
How did you come up individually and collectively with the idea of a CSPT program, of a interdisciplinary graduate sort of program that goes beyond the department, goes across the campus and so on?
It's a series of discussions. We ought to do something. We ought to make our courses available to people in other departments. We ought to collaborate. How do we do that? I don't think that particular decision took much time or energy. It was a fairly obvious thing to do. The question was, how do you do it? And I think from the very beginning, and you see the effects now, we concluded that we had to be very modest and simply make courses available to each other from other departments and somehow put them out under the rubric of a program within existing degree structures. So it was all very, very modest. It was very modest in terms of what we think the program has. It's an additional 2 courses that one put onto the existing disciplinary degree, and it was exceptionally modest in terms of resources. The Dean of Social Science in particular was quite helpful, supportive, and in comparative terms I would say generous in giving us enough money to fund 2 courses a year, one in politics and one in sociology, and that's the mechanism that enabled us to work for a long time. You're not talking much money, not talking much investment. We didn't demand much either, because we had a sense that actually if you demanded something you would simply stir up the waters, and it was much better to create rather than to demand investment. The assumption was this would be a fairly easy program to administer, because the administrative tasks were already taken up by the particular departments. And insofar as there was a director, it was merely a matter of coordination and finding a couple of people to teach interesting courses every year. So, on the one hand, little resources, on the other, a relatively easy administrative procedure, and I think that was more or less done intuitively with an understanding of how the university worked. And until numbers started growing considerably, about a decade after it began, it seemed like a fairly simple operation with a lot of positive outcomes.
You have already alluded to this. Could you elaborate on the process of foundation? Who did you approach? What did you propose to them exactly? How it was received? You alluded to it, but...
I alluded to it, but I'm the wrong person to ask, frankly. Warren was much more involved in it, putting the thing together institutionally, and Bill, and Rennie Warburton. The social science of the dean of social sciences of the day was quite amenable, and I think that was very important. The departments themselves were wary, very wary. Sociology, your own department, was especially wary. Philosophy was wary. Politics was not so bad, and indeed, in the end, very supportive. But I actually don't remember too many of the details, because there was nothing dramatic. It was more or less, this is an obvious thing to do, let's just do it. And in my department, the undergraduate theory thing had become quite successful. We were generating a lot of applications to do an MA in political theory. That worked out very well because we were acting as a kind of farm team to a number of big universities and producing very good students, very well trained, who went on to become quite well known after doing very short PhD programs. So we got an international reputation very, very quickly. And 20, 30 people must have come through this program and have got academic jobs in a very short space of time. So we had a certain cachet, and there was clearly a market. A market for political theorists is not like a market for economists. You don't make a lot of money out of it, but you make a lot of reputation. And the reputation was very strong, so we traded on the reputation, and that's how it is.
You mentioned that it took about a decade for the program to really, become what it became, and gain that international reputation, and just it's one of the most coveted graduate programs, interdisciplinary program in this area, right? Could you probably give me a few hints at the way in the beginning the whole issue of directing the program, recruiting, managing the program? How did you deal with those things? You started a program basically out of the blue, and now you brought together certainly 3 departments, and now you have to do it.
Yes, and there's a certain level of irony or contradiction about it, because as political theorists we're trained to think about founding, and I certainly specialize myself in the question of founding and its consequences for drawing limits. So that's more or less my intellectual problem. But actually the founding was not that difficult, in the sense that the barn door was open. You just had to walk through it. But you weren't going to walk into a huge Elysium fields. There wasn't a pot of gold out there waiting to be grabbed. As I said, it was a matter of simply putting in place sufficient administrative procedures, which were not particularly onerous, but did require a lot of intellectual skill and diplomacy, a lot of diplomacy, working back and forth between three relatively prickly departments. So I would say that was the core of the administrative problem. How to think about putting on courses that appeal across departments. And so what is it that one wants to teach, and what is it that one is prepared to put committees together for in order to supervise students. So it's very much an intellectually led function and a diplomatically led function. And I think it remains to this day. That's the core of what it means to run a program like this. We were fortunate in having various departmental secretaries who were very nice to us and efficient and so on. The mechanisms of formal communication were not put in place until very recently. In fact, it's been perhaps the weakest part of the entire program, because the university is not interdisciplinary, and it's not interdisciplinary at a very deep level administratively. It was very difficult to put together the procedures for actually admitting students, getting things done, precisely because we had no administrative support of our own. We had, and I believe still have, no base budget. We had, until very recently, no centralized administrative person to go to. We relied upon people allocating a certain percentage of their departmental workers, administrative assistants of one kind or another. So it was all ad hoc, and increasingly the strain was felt until the relatively recent new administrative procedures, but you wouldn't call them top-heavy, I would say. So I guess I would stress that the administrative role is primarily intellectual and diplomatic.
How did you recruit your first students?
From students that had seen us all teaching at the undergraduate level. And then gradually reputation grew, and we got people from Vancouver. We gradually got people in from around the country and around the world. And reputation. You know, the key to founding, in the words of, in relation to thinkers from Plato to Machiavelli to Rousseau to whoever, is a matter of virtue in the classical sense. You have to create a certain understanding of virtue, virtuosity, some energy that is a sign of life. If you show signs of life in a university, then students will flock to you. If you maintain very high standards, you will attract fewer but very good students. You are, in this field, necessarily looking for very, very good students, and if you cater to a mass market, you will fail. So you have to attract the best students. The best students will give you the reputation will attract more students. And it's a self-fulfilling process, but you cannot worry about numbers, really, except insofar as the university forces you to. You cannot worry about keeping people happy all the time. You have to simply say, this is what you want. This is what you deeply desire, and this will work for you. And if you come with the right product, to use the marketing language, then you will attract good students. And I think that's basically all there is to it. We solved much of our funding problem by attracting students who had external funding. We had a very high proportion of SHRC students, SHRC-funded students. And in relation to the departments, of course, the best students coming into every particular department tended to be CSPT students, and they were funded. So I think that kind of dynamic is what has made the program. Quality, quality, quality. And keep the standards high. The moment you drop the standards, your reputation goes, and as you know, if you lose your reputation, it takes a long time to get it back.
Do you have any stories to share with us?
No. My memory is so bad. I was once told I didn't get a job with the Canadian Diplomatic Service for two reasons. Actually, they didn't like my answers on the significance of the Iranian Revolution. And they asked, one of their questions was, tell us a joke. And I couldn't do it. So, in the same manner, I can't tell you stories.
That's good. So, right now, CSPT is growing, as you've seen, in terms of participating faculty. We are hopefully having a new department joining CSPT and so on. So CSPT seems to be, especially with the new sort of administrative repositioning of the program, how do you see the future of CSPT, and what are your concerns and your vision of the future of the program?
Like as I said, CSPT as we've known it is an effect of a particular historical condition, both locally and outside. And those conditions are rapidly changing, just as they were when we founded it. The early history, the first 25 years, if you want, of the program was really driven by theory. Whatever one means by theory, we can talk about that. But it was also driven by two other dynamics. One is the interdisciplinary move, and one is the ability of a program like this to engage with relatively new topics, the kinds of problems which don't fit in very well to the established disciplines. And there are a lot of those about. We've picked some rather than others because other parts of the university have taken up some, so environmental studies has obviously picked up the rapid emergence of the environment as a hot topic. But CSPT was into feminism very early, into post-colonial thinking, into local politics, into global politics, into literary theory, into social movement theory, all topics which were of their day, emerging and not well taken by the existing departments. So I think of the intellectual history of the program as it's occurred really as not a struggle but an interaction between those three dynamics. The focus on theory as theory, interdisciplinarity and novelty. And my sense is that we're in an age in which theory is the one that's under duress. Universities now see all kinds of advantages to pressing with interdisciplinarity. It's now not just trendy, but I think absolutely crucial for all universities to enable programs which cut across the disciplines, none of which can cope with their topics, with their subject matter. And there's enough big things going on in the world that the standard disciplines would like to get their hands on, but don't have the intellectual resources for it. So my sense is that the future of all programs like this actually is going to move increasingly towards pushing the interdisciplinary, pushing the novel topics, emerging thematics, if you want, but in ways which threaten the centrality of the theoretical, the problem of theory. So insofar as I have concerns, they're about the way in which theory is getting written out, not just here, but everywhere. The historical conditions under which theory meant something have changed. And theory itself is undergoing a change of meaning. But on the upside, I think the interdisciplinarity and the capacity to be intellectually exciting in relation to challenges of our day, the CSPT program has got a very promising future to it. So it's an upside and a downside. I do worry about the theory because in so many contexts, the kinds of historical awareness, the history of ideas, if you like, and the fairly deep engagement with philosophical debates, and the understanding that theory is a deeply political practice. Those three things, those three elements of what we used to think of as theory, I think those are being increasingly undervalued, not least by the challenges posed by the commercialization of universities, the market orientation of contemporary politics, and so forth. Effectively, you're replacing state law with market price as your ultimate source of value. And theory, as we've known it, has been much more able to engage with state law and its consequences than it has with market value. The economists have more or less taken a monopoly on that to our all common detriment. Does that?
What is your solution? So if you see theory to be under siege, which is actually, as you just mentioned quite correctly in my view, is a political practice, then how are we going to deal with the question of diversity and emerging new theoretical paradigms at a time when interdisciplinarity actually is propagated at the cost of theory?
Yeah, I think cultural studies programs have faced the same sorts of problems in the past. I think once you lose theory, universities find it very easy to use programs like this for their own purposes, which I don't object to, but I think it leads to a loss of integrity, intellectual, scholarly integrity. And my own view is that theory is always problem-driven. I don't care whether it's theory or empirical theory or policy theory. You ask a silly question, you get a silly answer. If you don't have a problem, then you have nothing to say, and all those kinds of cliches. And I think that there has been a tendency over the last decade, at least, in the general literature, to think of theory as somehow an abstract thing apart, more or less depoliticized. And I think there's a kind of number of generations have passed through of students who, not particularly here, but students who like to do theory without seeing any political consequences whatsoever. And I think that's a very unfortunate thing, but it's not simply a matter of theoretical traditions. I think it's common throughout the university. Largely because theory has become the search for answers. What is the right answer? What is the right ethic? What is the right ontology? What is the right epistemology? What's to give us a solution to something without actually specifying what the something is? One knew what the something was a couple of decades ago, and there was a kind of who is to do the acting in relation to what world? How do we act without getting caught into the standard tropes of representative democracy or nationalism or mass social movements or taking state power or all those kinds of things? There was a kind of an understanding of what the general problem, underlying problem was. Now I don't think we know. Is it climate change? Is it inequality? Is it poverty? Is it community? Is it language? What is it? The answer is it's all of the above. And so what's the connection between all of the above? You're working with a field of relationships. Well, how do you think relation? How do you think society in a world of relations? How do you think politics in a world of relations? How do you think states in a world of actually serious relations? How do you think cities? If things are increasingly dynamic, therefore, and more moving, more temporally organized, how do you think society, identity, politics, ethics in a world of movement? Well, we know the answers to most questions of principle if you make the assumption that the polis, the political system, the state is here, and I am in a certain relation to it, and outside there's another bunch of people who are living in another state, so we know how to think about the basic principles of the relationship between humanity and citizenship, or subject and state, or civil society and state. We know the basic answers, there's not much more to say. But given that we also know now that none of those things can be taken for granted, you're back to the need to ask some fairly fundamental problems, questions about who we are, where we're going, where we've come from, who this we is we're talking about, and so on. So my sense is you have to get back to some of the standard questions of political social theory, questions which have been around for three millennia probably, and not only in the Western tradition. I recognize that those are very, very hard questions. Recognize that they are questions which can be articulated in some of the newer theoretical languages of our time. But as soon as those theoretical languages are being mobilized, it's not easy to connect with a general population that's used to the cliches of statist politics. It's not easy to get these things across to undergraduates or indeed graduate students, and therefore it's much easier to simply repeat and regurgitate the standard tropes and try to do so in a way which captures a market perhaps, but which in the end is not that tied to the fairly traumatic problems which clearly confront us. If you're talking about world politics in my terms, what is the world? I think one has to make theory actually relevant again, because it's gone through a phase in which theorists have tended to talk to themselves, to become fairly abstracted. And certainly I think for people of my generation has become relatively depoliticized.
Interesting. Usually at this point I ask the interviewees if they have anything to say about the CSPT and how their experience was with the CSPT. How did you, how was life with CSPT in the past 25 years for Rob Walker?
Well, I'm very proud of CSPT. I've put a lot of energy into it. I've got a lot of energy back. I've gone through a series of very frustrating months, having so few resources, and especially having such, how do I put this politely, a fairly narrow appreciation in the wider university community for the stuff we've been doing. It's a bit frustrating. But I've enjoyed teaching it. I thought teaching the core courses, certainly teaching 4 or 5 of those courses has been one of the highlights of my teaching career, I would say. The students have been absolutely brilliant on occasion. Some of the seminars have been absolutely stunning. And much better than anything I've experienced teaching elsewhere when I've taught a fair number of places. So without CSPT, intellectual life in Victoria would be difficult. Victoria has its positives. I've chosen to live here for all the obvious reasons. But intellectually, it's a bit thin. Even though the university, as a university, is improved and improved, become more and more competent, I would not say it's become an intellectual centre. It's become a scientific centre, maybe. But the intellectual life, I think, has been relatively thin and narrow, and I think CSPT has done something to make it a bit wider and a bit more interesting. And certainly has enabled collaboration between people that one would not normally see, given that we're here and the next building is way over there, and you never see anybody. So I would say CSPT has been a crucial condition. One of the 2 crucial conditions, actually. The other one, I can get out of here quite often and visit other parts of the world. And so the ability to see what's going on in other parts of the world and to see collaboration amongst people in different departments here, that double move has more or less been my intellectual universe while living in Victoria.
Professor Rob Walker, thank you so much for participating in our video series.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.